She arrived with a wedding ring and a pair of work gloves, and within 48 hours, she was on her knees in the front yard tearing up her husband's prized rose beds with her bare hands while the whole town watched. They called her crazy. They called her shameless. Her own husband stood on the porch and told her to stop before she destroyed everything he'd worked for. Vera Holloway looked up at him, dirt on her face, sweat soaking through her dress, and said, "Grant, the roses aren't going to save us, but this ground will." This is the story of what she built and what she had to break first. If you're watching this, hit like, leave a comment with your city, and let's see how far this story travels. The stage from Millhaven took 11 hours, and for most of that ride, Vera Holloway sat wedged between a traveling seed salesman who smelled like turpentine and a large woman named Mrs. Hobbs who talked without pause about her sister's difficult childbirth in Abilene. Vera kept her face turned toward the window and watched the land change. She'd grown up in Ohio, in a town where the streets were paved with flat limestone, and the houses sat shoulder to shoulder like books on a shelf. She knew what order looked like, what managed land looked like, what a farm that was working looked like. And as the stage rolled deeper into Wyoming territory, she cataloged what she saw with a quiet, methodical eye. Good grassland here, poor drainage there, a creek bed that had shifted, fence lines that hadn't been mended in 2 or 3 seasons. She wasn't an anxious person by nature. Marrying a stranger through a correspondence agency didn't frighten her the way it seemed to frighten some women she'd spoken with at the bureau in Columbus. She'd read Grant Mercer's letters 4 times each, looking not for poetry but for character. And what she'd found was a man who was proud, sometimes stiff, occasionally funny in a way he didn't quite intend, and who was above all trying very hard. Whether he was succeeding was a different question, and one she suspected she'd have the answer to soon enough. The town of Redstone Crossing announced itself first as a smudge of smoke on the horizon, then as a cluster of wood-frame buildings along a wide dirt road that served as its main street. There was a general store, a livery, a boarding house with a sagging upper porch, a grain merchant's, and a hotel that had seen better decades. The stage pulled up in front of the hotel, and the driver dropped her trunk in the dust without ceremony. Grant Mercer was waiting. He was taller than she'd expected, lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate inconsistently. He had a good jaw and dark eyes that moved to her face and stayed there with an expression that was more searching than warm. Taking stock, she thought, the same way she was taking stock of him. He removed his hat. "Miss Holloway." "Mr. Mercer." She held out her hand and he shook it, which she appreciated. Some men, she'd been warned, treated the handshake as too forward. Grant looked almost relieved to have it done with. "I've got the wagon," he said. "The Reverend's available tomorrow morning, if that's agreeable." "That's fine." "You'll stay at Mrs. Quinn's tonight, the boarding house." He gestured vaguely. It's a proper arrangement. I thought you'd prefer—" "I appreciate it," she said. She did, genuinely. It told her something about him. They rode out to the ranch the next afternoon, after a brief ceremony in which the Reverend seemed more nervous than either of them, and Mrs. Quinn, who had apparently appointed herself Vera's one-person welcoming committee, pressed a jar of honey and a small loaf of bread into her hands and whispered, "You're going to be just fine, honey." With a confidence Vera found comforting even if she wasn't sure it was warranted. The Mercer Ranch sat about 2 miles outside town on the south side of a low ridge. The road running past it was the main supply route between Redstone Crossing and the railroad construction camps to the east, which meant there was regular traffic. Wagons, workers on horseback, supply teams moving in both directions throughout the day. Vera clocked this immediately, the way she clocked everything, with the quiet attention of a woman who had been taught since childhood that opportunity has a way of standing right in front of you without announcing itself. What she also noticed, pulling up the lane, was the front yard. It was, she had to admit, something to see. Grant Mercer had laid it out with the care of a man who believed in appearances the way some people believed in scripture. There was a neat gravel path from the gate to the front steps, bordered on both sides by raised beds filled with ornamental flowers. Roses climbing a trellis on the left, lavender and salvia in rows on the right, and along the fence a line of tall hollyhocks that were, even in the dry late summer heat, doing their level best to be beautiful. It was objectively the nicest looking thing on the property. It was also, objectively, completely useless. Vera said nothing. She stepped down from the wagon, picked up her bag, and followed her new husband inside. The house itself told the real story. The parlor was furnished, modestly, but furnished. There was a braided rug on the floor, a settee that had been recently dusted, curtains in the windows that matched. Grant had clearly put effort into it, which touched her even as it worried her, because effort put into curtains was effort not put into other things. The kitchen was where she went first, and Grant followed her with an expression that said he understood this was a kind of examination and had complicated feelings about it. She opened the pantry. The shelves were not bare exactly, but they were close enough to bare that the distinction felt academic. There was a sack of flour less than half full, a small tin of lard, some dried beans, maybe 3 pounds, salt, a jar of something preserved she couldn't immediately identify, a few potatoes with eyes already sprouting. She closed the pantry door. "How long?" she asked. Grant was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry? How long has it been like this?" He looked at the floor, then back at her, and she saw the thing that pride does to a man's face when it starts to crack, the way the jaw tightens and the eyes go a little flat, not from coldness, but from the effort of holding something in. "It's been a difficult couple of years," he said. "The herd got sick, lost about 30 head 18 months back, and there were loans I had to take to keep the operation going. I should have told you more in the letters." "Yes," she said without anger. "You should have. I didn't want to. Scare me off." He didn't answer, which was answer enough. She leaned against the kitchen table and looked at him squarely. She wasn't angry, and she needed him to understand she wasn't angry, though she also needed him to understand that what she was thinking was real and serious. "Grant, who do you owe?" He told her. It came out in pieces, the way things come out when a person has been keeping them inside too long. The bank loan, the equipment loan, a separate debt to a man named Hollis who ran the Redstone Crossing General Store, a smaller debt to the grain merchant. The total, when she'd worked it out in her head, was more than she'd expected but less than she feared. It was the kind of number that was survivable if they moved quickly and did the right things. "All right," she said. "All right? I'm not leaving if that's what you're waiting for me to say." She folded her arms. "But I need to understand what we're working with, and I need you to be honest with me from here on. Can you do that?" He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite relieved, not yet, but moving in that direction. "Yes," he said. "Good." She turned back toward the window that looked out over the front yard. The hollyhocks were waving a little in the evening breeze. "Then let's start talking about what's possible." No. She didn't bring it up for 3 days. She spent those 3 days doing what she always did when she arrived somewhere new, learning it. She walked the property from fence line to fence line, checking the soil, looking at water access, examining the outbuildings. The barn needed work but was structurally sound. The small chicken coop had 4 occupants left. The well was good. There was a natural low spot behind the barn where water pooled after rain, which was a drainage problem but could become something else with effort. She watched the road. In 3 days, she counted 47 wagons, 23 individual riders, and 2 large supply teams that pulled off to water their horses at the creek that crossed the property's east edge. Travelers stopped because there was water. That was the whole of it. They stopped, and then they went on, because there was nothing here to make them stay. She sat with that for a while. On the evening of the 3rd day, she and Grant ate supper together. Beans she'd stretched further than beans had any right to be stretched. And she set her fork down and said, "I want to talk to you about the front yard." He looked up. "What about it?" "I want to take it out." The silence that followed was the kind that has weather inside it. "Take it out," he repeated. "The flower beds, the gravel path, the decorative planting." She kept her voice level. "I want to pull it up and put in produce. Vegetables, herbs, enough to sell." Grant set his own fork down. He did it slowly, carefully, the way a man sets something down when he wants his hands free to gesture, or when he doesn't trust himself to hold anything without gripping too hard. "To who?" he said. "The road traffic." She watched him. 47 wagons in 3 days, Grant. Railroad workers, supply teams, travelers. They stop for the creek. If we give them something to buy, they'll stop for us. "We're a ranch," he said, "not a market stall. Right now, we're a ranch that can't pay its bills." She said it quietly, not cruelly, but she. The cattle are going to take a year minimum to recover. The debts are now. We need income now, and that road is income if we're willing to work it. Grant pushed back from the table and stood. He went to the window, not the one facing the road, she noticed, the one facing the yard, looking at the hollyhocks in the last of the evening light. That yard took me 2 years, he said. I know. People see this ranch, Vera. The men I do business with, they ride past. Hollis rides past. If I rip that up and put in turnips or whatever. He turned around. Do you understand what that says? That Grant Mercer is so broke, his wife is selling vegetables off the front porch? It says Grant Mercer is solving a problem, she said. That's all it says. That is not all it says. She looked at him steadily. He was a proud man. She'd known that from the letters. But pride she'd found was rarely simple. It was usually pride about something specific, protecting something specific. The question was always, what is he actually afraid of? Grant, she said, how long can we last on what's in that pantry? He didn't answer. 6 weeks, she said. Maybe 8 if we're careful. And then what? His jaw was tight. His eyes had that flat look again, the holding in look. I'll figure something out. I believe you want to, she said. But I'm here now. And I'm telling you I can see a way forward. And it starts with that yard. He was quiet for a long time. The evening outside had gone purple and soft. Down the road somewhere, a wagon creaked past. I need to think, he said finally. All right, she said, but don't think too long. She gave him 4 days. On the morning of the 5th day, she got up before dawn, put on her oldest dress, took the spade from the barn, and went out to the front yard. She started with the rose bed. The roses were in late bloom, full of the particular stubborn beauty that roses achieve when they are about to lose it, and she felt briefly the small ache of tearing up something that had never done anything wrong. But she'd grown up on a farm before her family moved to town, and she'd learned young that sentiment about soil is a luxury that soil itself doesn't share. She dug. The ground was harder than she'd liked, packed from the gravel path, dry from summer. She worked the spade in at an angle, pried up the roots, shook out what soil she could. Her shoulders ached within the first 20 minutes. She kept going. The sky over the ridge went from black to gray to a thin, tentative pink. She'd been working for about an hour when she heard the front door. Grant came down the porch steps. He had his boots on but no hat, his hair uncombed, and he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately read. It was too many things at once, anger and grief, and something else underneath both of those. He stopped at the edge of the gravel path. She straightened up, spade in hand, and looked at him. She didn't explain herself. She'd already explained. Vera, he said. His voice was careful, controlled. I told you I needed to think. And I gave you time to think, she said. We don't have more time. This is my land. It's our land now. She said it without heat. And this is how I'm choosing to help it. He stared at the torn earth, at the uprooted rose canes lying in the dirt, at the raw, dark soil she'd turned up. His face did something complicated. If you'd waited, we could have talked about it properly. We talked about it, she said. You said you needed to think. You thought. And the debts are still there. You didn't give me a chance to... Grant. She was not unkind, but she was firm. I'm not asking you to help me today. I'm not asking you to like it today. But I'm going to finish this bed, and tomorrow I'm starting the other side. And in 3 weeks I'm going to have something planted here that we can sell. You can be angry about it if you need to be. She turned back to the ground and kept working. He stood there for a while. She could feel him behind her, the weight of his pride and his anger and his helplessness, all mixed together into something that probably felt, from the inside, like a single terrible emotion. Then she heard his footsteps on the gravel, then the sound of the door, then silence, and the clean sound of her spade in the earth. The neighbors found out within 48 hours. Redstone Crossing was a town where information moved like weather, low, fast, and impossible to stop once it started. By the second morning, Vera could see riders slowing as they passed the gate, looking at the torn-up front yard with the particular expression of people who are scandalized but also very interested in having something to discuss at supper. She kept working. By the end of the first week, both ornamental beds were cleared and turned. Her palms had blisters that had blistered over blisters. Her back hurt in a way that suggested she would feel it for some time. She mixed what soil amendments she could cobble together from the barn, old manure, some ash, a pail of creek silt, and started laying out her planting plan. She thought hard about what to grow and in what quantities. Railroad workers and traveling supply crews weren't shopping for luxury. They wanted things that were filling, things that kept, things they could eat without a kitchen if it came to that. She planned for turnips and carrots in the ground. Good keepers, hard to kill, productive in quantity. Beans for drying, onions, and along the fence where they'd get the most sun, tomatoes, which wouldn't keep but would sell fast enough that it wouldn't matter. She also planned a separate bed, smaller, closer to the house, for herbs and greens, things that added value without much space. She had a head for this kind of calculation, the way some people had heads for music or for numbers. On the 9th day, a wagon pulled up at the gate. The driver leaned out, a sunburned man with a red neckerchief, and called, "Hey there, you selling them vegetables yet?" "Not for another few weeks," Vera called back from where she was crouched over a planting row. "But I'll have them." The man nodded. "Workers at Camp 4 been eating nothing but salt pork for 2 weeks. You have fresh vegetables, they'll buy everything you've got." "I'll keep that in mind," she said. He tipped his hat and drove on. She sat back on her heels and looked at the road for a moment. Then she got back to work. Well, the talk in town was not kind. She heard it in pieces, from Mabel Quinn at the boarding house, who reported it with obvious delight, and from the general store, where she went for seeds and overheard 2 women stop talking the moment she came through the door, which was its own kind of message. "Grant Mercer's wife is out there digging in the dirt like a farmhand. She's going to sell vegetables off the front fence. Can you imagine?" "Well, you know he's been struggling. I heard he owes Hollis 3 months back. Poor man. Coming home to a wife like that." Vera bought her seeds and walked out without comment. She'd grown up with gossip. She'd learned early that gossip is most dangerous when it's about something you actually care what people think of. And she'd made her peace long ago with not particularly caring. What she did care about was whether Grant cared, and that was more complicated. He was speaking to her, but barely. He did the work he'd always done. The animals, the equipment, the fence line on the east pasture that needed ongoing attention, and he did it thoroughly and without complaint. But there was a quality to the silence between them that wasn't peaceful. It was managed. He was managing it, keeping his feelings somewhere that wasn't in the room with her. She gave him the same space he'd given her. At the end of the 2nd week, she came in from outside after a long afternoon of laying irrigation channels. Simple gravity-fed trenches, nothing complex but time-consuming, to find Grant sitting at the kitchen table with a ledger open in front of him. He was looking at it the way people look at things they've been avoiding looking at, with a kind of exhausted resignation. He didn't look up when she came in. "Hollis came by today," he said. She poured herself a cup of water. What did he want?" "To remind me that the note comes due in 6 weeks. Can we pay it?" "Not as things stand." He closed the ledger, finally looked at her. His eyes were tired, and the stiffness that had been in his face for the past 2 weeks had softened into something that was honestly more painful to look at. It was the expression of a man who was running out of ways to insist he was fine. "How are the beds coming?" he said. Not quite a question, not quite a statement. "The first section should be up in another couple of weeks," she said. "The onions faster. The tomatoes I started from seed. Those will take longer, but I got a good germination rate." He nodded slowly. Was quiet. Then, "I put in some posts along the east bed. For the bean trellises. I didn't know if you needed—" "That's exactly what I needed," she said. "Thank you." Another silence. This one was slightly different in quality. "It's a good system," he said finally, still not quite looking at her. "The planting layout." I looked at it. "I've done it before," she said. "My grandmother kept a market garden. I used to help her when I was small." He nodded again. He picked up the ledger and set it on the shelf. Stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking out. "I'll do the irrigation work on the west side," he said, still facing the window. "In the morning, before the rest." It wasn't an apology. She didn't think it was meant to be, and she didn't need it to be. It was something more practical and possibly more genuine. It was the moment a man decides to stop fighting the tide and start swimming. "That would help," she said simply. And the next morning, He was out there before she was. On a Tuesday in late September, 3.5 weeks after Vera had taken the spade to the rose beds, she'd fashioned a rough table from 2 sawhorses and a plank of pine, set it up just inside the gate with a cloth over it, and laid out what she had: 2 crates of turnips, a basket of onions, a bundle of fresh herbs tied with twine. It wasn't impressive. She knew it wasn't impressive. But the railroad camp was half a mile east. The supply road ran right past the gate, and she had a sign she'd painted herself: fresh produce, fair price, propped against the fence post where it could be seen from 50 yards. By noon, she'd sold everything on the table. The first customer was a railroad foreman named Dodd, a heavy, no-nonsense man with a beard going gray who pulled his horse up, looked at the table and said, "How much for the turnips?" 3 cents a pound, she said. He bought 2 pounds without bargaining. Then he said, "You going to have these regular?" "Tuesday and Friday," she said. She hadn't actually planned this until the words came out of her mouth, but she committed to it. "All right," Dodd said. "I'll tell the camp cook." The second customer was a woman in a supply wagon who bought the herbs without asking the price, just held them up to her nose and said, "Lord, I've been smelling salt beef for 3 months," and pushed coins into Vera's hand. By the time the table was empty, Vera had made enough to buy another 2 sacks of seed and still have money left. She stood at the gate for a moment after the last customer left, her hands in her apron pocket, feeling the weight of the coins. It wasn't a fortune. It wasn't even close to enough to touch the debts. But there was something about the specific realness of it, money earned by her own hands from her own ground, right here, today, that had a quality she found difficult to describe. It felt like evidence. Grant was working on the barn roof when she came back inside. She went up the ladder and set the coins down beside him on the shingles in a small pile. He looked at them, looked at her. She went back down the ladder without saying anything because she didn't need to say anything. That was the first Tuesday. By the 3rd week of October, the table was not enough. The word had spread through the camps faster than she'd anticipated. Not just Camp 4, but Camp 7 and the main supply depot at Hartley's Ford, 12 miles east. Workers came specifically, on their rest days, driving out to buy whatever she had. Dodd came faithfully every Tuesday and Friday, often with a list. A cook named Esperanza from Camp 7 appeared one Friday with a cart and bought so many onions that Vera had to apologize and hold some back for other customers. She expanded. There was no choice. She took over the remaining decorative area along the fence, put in more turnips and carrots, added a second tomato row. She convinced Grant to build 2 more raised beds on the south side of the house where the sun held late into the afternoon. She tracked sales in a ledger she'd bought from the general store. Incoming, outgoing, projected harvest, projected income. The cash box, by late October, had enough in it to cover the interest on Hollis's note. She and Grant paid it together, walked into the general store on a Wednesday morning, and Grant put the money on the counter in front of Hollis, a stout, red-faced man who was already beginning to guess that the Mercer situation was improving faster than he'd expected. And Hollis took the money with a neutrality that was itself a kind of defeat, riding back out to the ranch. Grant was quiet for a long time. The fall light was long and gold over the grassland, the kind of light that makes even ordinary country look like something worth painting. "How much left in the box?" he asked. "Enough to pay the smaller feed bill," she said. "After that, we're back to operating on the current income. But the November harvest should cover Vera." He stopped the wagon. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the road, at the empty country, then at her. "I was wrong," he said. It came out without decoration, which was somehow more powerful than if he'd worked up to it. "About the yard. About what it meant." He paused. "About a lot of things, probably." She waited. "I kept thinking about what people would see," he said, "when they rode past, what they'd think. And then I watched you out there every morning, and I couldn't stop thinking that I was the one standing in the way of something that was actually working, and that I was doing it because I was too proud to be wrong in public." He looked at her. "That's a small reason to let things fail." "It's a human reason," she said. "It's a stupid one. Sometimes they're the same." She held his gaze. "You came around, Grant. That matters." He looked at the road again. "I want to put in a covered stand," he said. For winter. So you can sell in all weather. I'll build it this week if you tell me the right dimensions. Something shifted in her chest. Not dramatically, not in the way stories tend to describe it, a sudden warmth or a flowering or whatever, but something real and quiet. Like a door that had been stuck deciding to open. 12 feet by 8, she said, and I'll want a shelf at counter height on the south wall. Done, he said. He picked up the reins, and they drove home. The gossip in town had shifted, though it hadn't stopped. Gossip never stops. It only changes subject. Now it was less about how Vera Mercer was a shameless woman who'd humiliated her husband in public, and more about how there was fresh produce for sale out at the Mercer Ranch, and it was reasonably priced and the quality was good. These are not incompatible observations, and small towns have a gift for holding both. Mabel Quinn came out on a Friday in early November with a basket and stayed for an hour. She was a tall woman in her 50s, wiry and sharp-eyed, with the kind of energy that suggests she had been asked to slow down at some point and decided not to. She looked at everything with open interest. The beds, the stand, the new cold storage pit Vera was digging behind the barn. You know what this reminds me of? Mabel said, standing at the gate with a bunch of carrots in her hand. What? Vera said. My Aunt Pierce had a place down in Colorado back in the 60s. Before all the rail came through, she did the same thing. Sold produce off her property to travelers. Mabel looked at the road. She did all right for herself. Did she? Up to a point. Mabel turned back. Then a man named Ostroff decided he didn't like her doing well and made her life interesting. She said interesting the way people say things they mean the opposite of. You know Cedric Blackwell? Vera had heard the name. Blackwell was the dominant merchant in the region, supplier to several of the railroad camps, controller of most of the flour and grain that moved through Redstone Crossing. She hadn't had direct dealings with him yet, but she'd seen his wagons on the road, recognizable by a yellow stripe painted on the side panels. I know of him, she said. Well. Mabel set her basket down on the stand and began selecting carrots with the careful attention of a woman who takes vegetables seriously. He's been doing the railroad supply contracts for 3 years, food, dry goods, flour, and he's been charging them about 30% more than he should because there's nobody else to go to. She paused. Until now, there might be. Vera was quiet for a moment. You're telling me he's going to notice what we're doing. I'm telling you he's probably already noticed. Mabel met her eyes. He's a careful man. Not kind, but careful. She picked up her basket. I just thought you should know who's on the road out here. After Mabel left, Vera stood at the gate for a while, looking east toward the railroad camps. The afternoon was cooling off, the sky going that pale November white. A supply wagon with a yellow stripe on the side went past without slowing. She watched it until it was out of sight. Then she went inside and added a line to her ledger. Note, Blackwell. Watch. She had no way of knowing yet exactly how much attention Cedric Blackwell was about to pay to the Mercer Ranch. She had no way of knowing what the next winter would cost her, or what it would ask of her, or how close it would come to taking everything she'd built. But the ground was producing, the debts were shrinking, and her husband was building her a covered market stand out of good pine lumber. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a beginning that was alive, and it was hers. The covered stand went up in the first week of November, and Grant built it better than she'd asked for. She'd said 12 by 8. He made it 14 by 10, with a proper overhang on the south side to keep rain off the customers, and a shelf that ran the full length of the back wall at exactly counter height. He used pine he'd had stored in the barn for 2 seasons, dry and tight-grained, and he fit the joints with the careful attention of a man who'd grown up building things and hadn't done enough of it lately. When he finished, he stood back and looked at it with the particular expression of someone who has surprised themselves. It's good work, Vera said, standing beside him. It'll hold through winter, he said. I put extra bracing on the north wall for wind. She looked at the overhang, the solid posts, the clean lines of it. Grant, this is better than what I asked for. He shrugged, but she could see he was pleased. Didn't see the point in doing it halfway. That was the thing about Grant Mercer that she was learning slowly. The way you learn anything real about a person, in pieces, over time, through the accumulation of small evidence. He was not a man who did things halfway. He was a man who had spent 2 years doing the wrong things thoroughly, which was a different problem entirely, and one that was correctable. She stocked the stand for the first time on a Friday morning in early November. She had good quantities now. The root vegetables had come in strong, the onions were cured and keeping well in the cold storage pit, and she'd started baking bread twice a week, simple loaves in the Dutch oven, because 3 separate customers had asked if she sold any, and she'd decided that asking was reason enough to start. The bread sold faster than the vegetables. This was instructive. Railroad workers, she'd come to understand, were not eating badly because they didn't want to eat well. They were eating badly because there was nothing else available. Blackwell's supply wagons brought flour, salt pork, dried beans, molasses, the fundamentals, the things that would keep a man alive without doing much else for him. A fresh loaf of bread, a bunch of carrots, a jar of pickled onions. These were not luxuries. They were the difference between a meal that kept you going and a meal you actually wanted to eat, and men who worked 12 hours a day in the cold were willing to pay for that difference. Vera raised her bread price by half a cent after the 3rd Friday and sold just as many loaves. She kept that observation in her ledger, too. December came hard that year. The first snow hit in the 2nd week and stayed, which was not unusual for Wyoming, but was earlier than most people had hoped. The road traffic thinned but didn't stop. Supply operations couldn't wait for weather, and the railroad construction pushed year-round except in the most extreme conditions. Vera insulated the cold storage pit with straw and kept her root vegetables through the cold, and she modified her baking schedule to match the supply wagon's routes, so she had fresh bread ready when the morning teams came through heading east. It was during one of those cold December mornings that she met Thomas Dodd properly. She'd been selling to him for 2 months, but their exchanges had always been transactional. He pulled up, he bought, he left, occasionally with a comment about what was selling well at the camp. He was a taciturn man, not unfriendly, and she'd respected the fact that he didn't try to make conversation he didn't have interest in making. But that morning he bought his usual order, then stood at the stand for a moment longer than necessary, turning his hat in his hands. "Something else?" she asked. "Maybe," he said. "You know we got a new camp manager out at 4? I heard something about it. Man named Briggs. He's trying to upgrade what the men are eating. Better food, fewer sick days. That's his argument to the railroad company, and it's not a bad one." Dodd looked at the loaves on the shelf. "He's going to want a supply contract. Regular amounts, reliable delivery. Not just whatever's available on a Tuesday." Vera was quiet for a moment. "How much are we talking about?" 40 loaves a week to start, plus whatever produce you can supply consistently. He'd want it twice weekly, same days, no gaps. Dodd met her eyes. "It's real money if you can handle the volume." She thought about the oven. She thought about the flour she was buying from Hollis's store, and the markup on that flour, and whether she could get a better price somewhere else. She thought about 40 loaves twice a week, plus her current market sales. "I can handle it," she said. She was not entirely certain this was true, but she was certain enough. "I'll tell Briggs," Dodd said. He put his hat back on. "One more thing." He paused. "Blackwell's been supplying for 3 years. Briggs isn't happy with his pricing, which is why he's looking. But Blackwell's not going to be happy about this." He said it plainly, not as a warning exactly, more as information offered by someone who thought she should have it. "I appreciate you telling me," she said. Dodd nodded once and drove east. She stood at the stand for a moment after he left. The cold was sitting in her fingers. Down the road, a yellow-striped wagon was moving in the opposite direction, coming back from the camps, and she watched it pass without acknowledging it and without being acknowledged. She went inside and started revising her production numbers. The contract with Camp 4 took effect in January. Twice weekly, Tuesday and Friday, she loaded the small ranch wagon herself, drove the half-mile to the camp, and delivered 40 loaves plus whatever produce she had in quantity. Briggs was a compact, businesslike man in his 30s who inspected her first delivery with the attention of someone who had been disappointed before and was prepared to be disappointed again. He broke open one of the loaves, looked at the crumb, smelled it. "Good," he said, in the tone of a man who awards compliments sparingly. She also negotiated for Grant to handle the delivery on the days she needed to stay on the property for planting or production work. This required a brief conversation that she'd been half anticipating with some nervousness, because asking Grant to drive bread to a railroad camp felt, given the history of the past few months, like potentially tender ground. He surprised her. "Makes sense," he said, when she laid it out. "I know the road, and it's half a mile. Not a big operation." "You're sure you don't mind?" He gave her a look that had something dry and self-aware in it. "Vera, I spent 2 years being proud about the wrong things. I can drive bread to a railroad camp." She laughed. It was the first time she'd laughed easily around him, and she could see from his expression that he noticed, and that it mattered to him. The production pressure was real. 40 loaves twice a week was 80 loaves a week, on top of her market sales, and that meant flour, and lots of it. She was buying from Hollis at the general store, but Hollis was buying from Blackwell's distribution network, which meant Blackwell's markup was in every sack she touched. She'd been tracking the numbers and the margin was thin, not unsustainable, not yet, but thin enough that any increase in flour prices would put the contract at risk. She had started to ask around quietly about other flour sources. This was how she found out about Owen Marsh. Mabel Quinn mentioned him in February. Sitting at Vera's kitchen table over a cup of the tea Vera now kept in stock, specifically because Mabel visited roughly twice a month and had opinions about tea. "There's a man named Marsh," Mabel said, wrapping her hands around her cup. "Has a small mill about 8 miles south, past the river crossing. He's been trying to sell direct for years, but Blackwell controls the distribution, so nobody'll deal with him. His flour's fine. I've used it. He's just been cut out." 8 miles south, Vera said. "Roads passable in decent weather, rough in winter, not impossible." Vera wrote it in her ledger. Owen Marsh, South Mill. She didn't act on it immediately. The winter road was genuinely difficult, and she had enough to manage. But she held it in mind the way she held anything that might be useful later. February was when she started to feel the shape of what she'd built. Not in a triumphant way. Triumph felt premature, and she'd grown up with enough farm experience to know that premature triumph was an invitation to disaster. But when she went through the ledger at the end of February, comparing the numbers to what they'd been in September, the difference was undeniable. 3 of the 5 outstanding debts were gone. Not reduced, gone. The feed bill, the equipment loan, the smaller personal debt that Grant had been most ashamed of. The bank loan and Hollis's note were still there, but they were being serviced regularly, on time, without the cringing anxiety of a man who wasn't sure if he could cover them. Grant had found this out on a Tuesday evening when she'd spread the ledger across the kitchen table and walked him through it, pointing to each line with her finger the way her grandmother had once taught her. Never tell a man the numbers. Show him the numbers, it's different. He'd sat with it for a long time, not saying anything. She let him sit with it. 3 gone, he said finally. "Yes. Since September. 5 months. He looked at the remaining 2. "The banknote is the big one." "It is, but look at the trajectory." She pointed to the monthly income column. "If the Camp 4 contract holds and we add the spring produce volume, we should be able to make a significant payment on the banknote by July." She paused. "August at the latest." Grant looked up at her. His face had the open, slightly undone quality of a man whose defenses have been made unnecessary. "Vera," he said, "when I wrote those letters, to the agency, I put in there that I was looking for a capable woman, a practical woman." He shook his head. "I don't think I understood what I was asking for." "Well," she said, "now you know." "I don't know if capable covers it." She closed the ledger. "It covers enough." He reached across this table and put his hand over hers. It was the first time he'd touched her with any tenderness. Not the handshake at the stage stop, not the careful, courteous distance of a man who was still figuring out how to share a house with someone he'd chosen to trust, but didn't yet know. This was different. This was deliberate. She turned her hand over and held his. Neither of them said anything. Outside, the February wind pushed at the house walls, and the lamp on the table threw steady orange light across the ledger pages. And it was enough. It was, she thought, very nearly enough. March came in rough. The snow came back in the second week, heavier than the December storms, and held for 9 days. The road was intermittently passable, and the camp deliveries fell behind by 2 days. Briggs sent word that he understood, but expected them back on schedule as soon as the road cleared, and Vera pushed the wagon out the morning after the snow finally stopped to find the road rutted and half frozen and the axle taking a strain that made her think carefully about the next week's delivery schedule. It was on one of those cold, difficult March mornings that she met Cedric Blackwell for the first time. She'd seen his wagons for months, but she hadn't seen him, and she hadn't gone looking. She was at the stand, mid-morning, a lull between the early supply teams and the midday traffic, when a horse and rider came up the road from the east at a pace that wasn't casual. The rider was a man in his 50s, heavier than average, with a gray beard kept short and a coat that was expensive in a way he clearly didn't mind being noticed. He rode the kind of horse that announced itself. A big gray, well-fed, very clean for March roads. He pulled up at the gate and looked at the stand. Then he looked at Vera. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. He said it the way some men say things they've already decided about. "Mr. Blackwell," she said. Something shifted in his face. Brief, controlled. He hadn't expected her to know him. "You know who I am. You have a distinctive wagon," she said. He looked over the stand, taking his time. The remaining loaves on the shelf, the baskets of root vegetables, the hand-lettered price list she'd tacked to the post. His expression was the careful, neutral expression of a man taking inventory. "You've been busy," he said. "Yes." "I hear you have a supply arrangement with Camp 4. "I do." He let a pause sit there, which she recognized as a technique. Some people fill silences because they're uncomfortable. Others use silence as pressure. Blackwell was clearly the second kind. "That camp has been in my supply network for 3 years, he said finally. "I'm aware," she said. "Mr. Briggs made a change without consulting me." "I believe Mr. Briggs has that authority," she said, keeping her voice level. Blackwell looked at her with the expression of a man deciding how to categorize something. Not hostile exactly, not yet. More like a man who is recalibrating a situation he expected to be simpler. "You're doing all right out here," he said. "For the moment." Another pause. "Small operations have a way of running into difficulties." "So do large ones," she said. Shima. His horse shifted. He steadied it with one hand, still looking at her. Then, to her mild surprise, he almost smiled. Not warmly, but with something like professional acknowledgement. "Good morning, Mrs. Mercer," he said. "Good morning," she said. He turned the horse and rode back east. She stood at the stand for a moment after he'd gone. Her hands were steady. Her heart rate, she noted, was somewhat less steady, but that was a private matter. She went inside and added to the note she'd made months ago. Blackwell. He came. Watch more carefully. That same week, she wrote a letter to Owen Marsh at the South Mill, introducing herself and inquiring about his current flour prices. She sent it with the Tuesday mail rider and waited. His reply came in 4 days. His price was 15% below what she was paying Hollis. The road south was rough but navigable, he wrote in a careful hand, and he would hold a standing order if she wanted one. She showed the letter to Grant over supper. He read it twice. "That's a significant difference." "Yes." "Hollis won't be happy." "Hollis is Blackwell's man," she said, "or close enough to it. Every sack I buy from Hollis has Blackwell's margin in it." Grant set the letter down on the table. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the window. "If we switch to Marsh and Blackwell decides to make trouble—" "He's already decided to make trouble," she said. "He came out here and told me so, in the careful way men do when they want to sound like they're not threatening you." Grant turned to look at her. "He won't let this sit," she said. "He doesn't have to move against us tomorrow or next month. But if we keep growing, he will. The question is whether we're stronger when that happens or weaker. And buying from Marsh makes us stronger. The margin goes up. We have more room. We're not dependent on his supply chain." Grant looked at the letter again. Then he looked at her. There was a directness in his expression now that hadn't been there in September, a quality of meeting things as they were rather than as he wished they were. "All right," he said. "Right back to Marsh." She did that evening, by lamplight. April arrived with a thaw that felt almost aggressive after the long winter, the ground going soft and fragrant and ready, and Vera was out in the beds within 2 days of the last frost, opening up new sections, expanding the tomato rows, adding cucumbers and squash for the summer supply. Grant worked beside her most mornings now without being asked. He'd developed a competence with the beds that she respected. He had good hands with physical work, understood drainage and spacing intuitively, and he'd made a number of improvements to the irrigation system on his own initiative that she'd had no objection to whatsoever. They worked alongside each other in a way that had found its rhythm slowly and was better for having been slow. They didn't talk constantly. They didn't need to. There was the work and the land and the road full of customers and the ledger that was moving in the right direction. And there was the knowledge, the quiet, daily, practical knowledge of someone working next to you who is entirely on your side. It wasn't the marriage either of them had probably imagined. But it was, she thought, watching Grant sink fence posts with efficient, unhurried strokes. Something that might be better than imagined. She went back to turning her soil and didn't say this out loud. Because some things are more stable for being kept internal. The Camp 4 contract expanded in April. Briggs added 2 other camps to the arrangement, pending the ability to meet volume. Vera and Grant spent a long Sunday evening going through what that would require. A second oven, which meant either building a separate outdoor baking structure or negotiating use of a larger facility. More flour, which Marsh could supply. More labor for the delivery runs, which was the part that gave her pause. I can't run the production and the delivery both, she said. I'll take the deliveries, Grant said. Full time, essentially. 3 days a week. There's nothing else I'd rather be doing, he said, without apparent irony. She looked at him. I mean that, he said. Vera, this works, what we're doing here. And I was the one standing in the way of it. He looked down at the table. 3 days a week driving bread to railroad camps is a fair trade for having something worth doing. She wanted to say something to that, but what came out instead was, we'll need to hire someone for the spring planting expansion if we're both tied up with the contract. I know a family south of the ridge, he said, the Parkers. They've got a teenage boy, responsible. I could ask. Do that, she said. And so it expanded again, the way it had been expanding since that first September morning when she'd pushed her spade into the rose bed's hard earth. Not in one dramatic moment, but in increments, one decision following another, each one small enough to seem manageable, and all of them together adding up to something she hadn't quite been able to see at the beginning. She could see it more clearly now, which was why, when a letter arrived from the Railroad Regional Office in the 3rd week of April, she recognized immediately that it was not routine, and that whatever was inside it, Cedric Blackwell had almost certainly had a hand in writing it. The letter came in a plain envelope with the railroad company's letterhead pressed into the seal, and Vera opened it at the kitchen table while Grant stood by the window eating an early breakfast before the morning delivery run. She read it once. Then she read it again. What is it? Grant asked. She set it on the table and smoothed it flat with her palm. The Railroad Regional Office is reviewing all independent supply contracts under 50 miles of the Eastern Expansion Corridor. They're implementing a new qualification standard. She looked up. We have 6 weeks to demonstrate we can meet double our current production quota on a consistent basis. If we can't prove it, the contract gets pulled. Grant put down his cup. He came to the table and read it himself, which took him longer because he was reading it carefully, looking for something she might have missed. She let him look. Double, he said. Double the bread, double the produce volume. Same delivery schedule, no gaps. He sat down. He looked at the letter, not at her. 6 weeks. Starting from the date of the letter, she calculated, which means we have until the 2nd week of June. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, the April morning was doing what April mornings did, cool and bright, with a restless wind coming off the ridge. Somewhere in the yard, the rooster was conducting his ongoing argument with the world. This is Blackwell, Grant said. Yes. Can he actually do this? Push the railroad to change their own contracts? He supplies 4 camps and 2 depot operations, she said. He's been doing business with that regional office for close to a decade. Men like that don't have to write the rules themselves. They just have to talk to the right people over supper. She folded the letter and set it aside. The standard might even be legitimate. That's the elegant part of it. It's possible the railroad does want higher volume suppliers. Blackwell just made sure the timing worked for him. Grant was looking at the table. She could see him running the numbers in his head. He'd gotten better at this over the winter, more fluent with the production math, and she appreciated that he was doing it instead of just waiting for her to tell him. To double bread production, he said slowly, we need double the flour. We need the outdoor baking structure, not next month. Now, this week. We need the Parker boy full-time, and probably someone else for delivery. And the produce volume. He stopped. The spring beds aren't ready to produce at double capacity yet. We planted for current contract volume. I know. So we'd have to buy in from somewhere to supplement. I know that too. He looked at her. Can we do it? She was honest with him because dishonesty at this point would be a luxury she couldn't afford. If everything goes right and nothing goes wrong and the weather cooperates and Marsh can supply the flour we'd need on short notice. She paused. That's a lot of conditions. And if one of them doesn't hold, then we miss the quota, we lose the contract, and we're back to the market stand and the smaller sales. She met his eyes. Which wouldn't kill us. We're not where we were in September, but it would mean Blackwell won, and he'd make sure everyone knew it. Grant was quiet. Then, what do you want to do? I want to try, she said, but I need you to understand what we're taking on. He looked at the letter again. Something in his expression settled, not into confidence exactly, but into the particular stillness of a person who has made a decision and is done arguing with themselves about it. Tell me what you need first. She told him. The next 10 days were the hardest sustained work of Vera's adult life, and she had not led a soft adult life. Grant started the outdoor baking structure the same afternoon, working until the light failed and then getting up before it returned. He had the frame up in 3 days, the roof on in 5, the stone baking platform constructed and seasoned on the 7th day. It was not beautiful. It was functional. Enclosed enough to keep wind off the fire, open enough to manage the heat, with space for 2 large Dutch ovens working simultaneously alongside the new cast iron range they'd bought on credit from a hardware supplier in Millhaven who was willing to wait 60 days. Vera, meanwhile, was dealing with flour. Owen Marsh got her letter on a Thursday and arrived at the ranch personally on Saturday morning, which told her something about how seriously he was taking the arrangement. He was a quiet man, perhaps 60, with the careful movements of someone who had spent decades around machinery that didn't forgive carelessness. He looked at her production setup with the professional interest of a miller evaluating a baker, asked several precise questions, and gave her a number. I can get you that volume, he said. It'll strain my current stock in the short term. I'd need some payment in advance to cover the additional grain I'll have to acquire. How much in advance? He told her. It was not a small number. She looked at Grant. Grant looked at the cash box. The advance would leave them with almost nothing in reserve. If anything went wrong, a wagon breakdown, a crop failure, a week of weather that stopped delivery, they'd have no buffer at all. We'll do it, she said. Marsh nodded once. I'll have the first load out Tuesday. After he left, she and Grant stood in the yard for a moment without speaking. The advance had been decided, and the decision felt like standing at the edge of something, not recklessly, not stupidly, but with the clear-eyed awareness that there was no particularly safe option left. We're all in, Grant said. We have been for a while, she said. We just didn't have it stated clearly before. He made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. Then he picked up his hammer and went back to work on the baking structure. The Parker boy, his name was Eli, 16, with the serious face of someone who'd been doing adult work since he was 12, came on full-time that week and proved himself worth every cent within the first 2 days. He learned fast, didn't ask unnecessary questions, and had the particular quality that Vera valued above almost everything else in a worker. He noticed what needed doing without being told. By the end of the first week, she trusted him with the bread production on her morning delivery days, which was a level of trust she didn't extend lightly. The production ramped up. It was not clean, it was not smooth. There were burned batches and miscalculated yields. And one morning, when the outdoor oven's fire went wrong and they lost 3 hours and had to push the delivery back until afternoon, with Vera driving hard to make the camp in time and arriving with bread that was still warm but barely. Briggs raised an eyebrow at the delivery time. She explained the fire problem without making excuses. It can't happen again, he said. It won't, she said. She was not entirely certain of this, but she said it, and then she went back and figured out what had gone wrong with the fire and fixed it. By the end of the 3rd week, the production was stable at the new volume. Not comfortable, not easy. Stable. The bread was going out on schedule. The produce was supplemented by careful purchasing from 2 small farms east of the river whose owners she'd approached directly, paying fair prices and being straight about what she needed. The ledger showed the new numbers in both directions. Higher income, higher costs, a margin that was workable but unforgiving. Then in the 4th week, Blackwell moved again. She found out about it from Mabel Quinn, who arrived on a Wednesday morning with the expression of a woman carrying news she'd rather not carry. She sat down at the kitchen table and folded her hands in front of her and said, He's gone to Hollis. Vera waited. Hollis has stopped selling to Owen Marsh, Mabel said. Blackwell pushed him. Hollis buys his grain from Blackwell's distribution network. Always has. And apparently Blackwell made it clear that if Hollis kept selling to Marsh, that arrangement ends. She paused. Marsh can't source grain locally anymore. His regular suppliers are all connected to Blackwell one way or another. Vera sat with this. How far does that reach? Far enough that Marsh sent a boy to my door this morning asking if I knew how to reach you, Mabel said. He said he can fulfill your current order, but the one after that? She shook her head. Vera stood up. She went to the window and looked out at the road. A supply wagon was going east, loaded high, moving at a good pace in the spring morning. Blackwell's stripe on the panels. How long has he been building this? She said. It wasn't really a question. Years, Mabel said. It didn't look like a stranglehold until you needed to get out of it. He's not moving against us directly, Vera said, still looking at the road. He's cutting the supply chain. If Marsh can't get grain, we can't get flour. If we can't get flour, you can't make the quota. And we lose the contract. She turned around. And we've spent everything on the advance to Marsh, and the baking structure, and the additional labor, and we're left with... She stopped. Let the calculation sit. Mabel was watching her with the careful attention of someone who wanted to help, but was waiting to see what shape the help should take. He's patient, Vera said. That's what worries me about him. He didn't come at us when we were small. He waited until we were big enough that losing would actually hurt. That's his way, Mabel said. He waited out the Duro brothers over in Castor County 2 years ago. Let them build up and then pulled the ground out. What happened to them? Sold at a loss and left. Vera sat back down. She was thinking, not panicking, which she considered a small but non-trivial personal accomplishment under the circumstances. Working through the problem with the methodical focus she'd applied to every other problem since she'd arrived here. Supply chain cut. Flour source compromised. Deadline in 3 weeks. Cash reserves nearly gone. She laid it out in her head like a ledger. What's south of the river? She asked. Mabel looked at her. What do you mean? Past Marsh's mill, farther south. What's the farming situation down there? Mabel thought about it. There are families down there, wheat farmers mostly, small operations, been there since before the rail came through. They've always sold to Blackwell's buyers, or tried to. He controls the prices so low most of them barely break even. She paused. Why? Because if Blackwell controls the local supply chain, Vera said, then the people he's been squeezing are the ones who might be willing to deal with someone else. Mabel was quiet for a moment. Then slowly, something changed in her face. The look of a person seeing where a line of reasoning goes and deciding whether to say it's foolish or whether to say it might work. That's a lot of ground to cover in 3 weeks, she said. I know. You'd have to go yourself. Letters take too long. I know that too. And there's no guarantee any of them have inventory to sell, or that the quality's right, or that they'd... Mabel. Vera looked at her. Is there a reason it can't work? Or are you listing reasons it might be difficult? Mabel considered. Difficult, she admitted. Difficult I can work with. Grant came in from the barn at that point, took one look at both their faces, and said, What happened? Vera told him. She laid it out straight, no softening it, because softening it would only slow down the response. He listened without interrupting, which she'd come to recognize as his way of processing. He went still and internal, and then when she finished, he came back out and engaged. So we need wheat, he said, or another flour source, but wheat is more likely if we're looking south. I know some of those families, he said. Not well, but I've met a few of them at the stockyards in Millhaven. He thought about it. There's a man named Calloway who's been at those stockyards every season for as long as I can remember. He's from south of the river. Could you reach him? I can try the stockyards first. If he's not there, someone will know how to find him. She looked at him. He looked back at her. There was no drama in it, no heroic declaration, no moment of grand resolve. It was just two people who had figured out how to think together, looking at a problem and deciding to move. Go tomorrow, she said. He went. She stayed because the production couldn't stop. The bread went out Tuesday and Friday, on schedule, with Vera and Eli splitting the baking work across 14-hour days. She kept the ledger current, tracked the flour inventory. She had 10 days left in Marsh's current supply, and managed the deliveries with the tight attention of someone counting every hour. Grant came back from Millhaven on Thursday evening, dusty and tired and with news. He'd found Calloway at the stockyards, as he'd hoped. Calloway was a deliberate man, slow to trust, who'd listened to Grant's explanation without much visible reaction, and then said he knew two other farmers south of the river who had been wanting to sell direct for years, but had been locked out by Blackwell's pricing. He'd also said something else, which Grant reported carefully. He said Blackwell's been shorting them on payments for 2 seasons. Not by a lot. Not enough to fight over in one instance, but consistent. Every sale, a little less than the agreed price. A bookkeeping error, Blackwell's people always say. Grant looked at his hat, turning it in his hands. Calloway said he'd stopped selling to Blackwell's buyers entirely last fall. He's been sitting on his wheat with no good market. How much does he have? Vera asked. Enough to cover our shortfall, and he says the other 2 families... Grant paused. They might be willing to sell too if we can get to them and make the case. What kind of case? Fair price, Grant said. Consistent buyer, no Blackwell in the middle. Vera looked at the window. Outside, the spring evening was long and golden, the kind of light that made everything look more settled than it was. Go back, she said. Take the wagon. I'll draw up a fair price offer. Look at what we can pay and still make margin. And you take it to Calloway and whoever he can bring. That's another 2 days away from the production. Eli and I will manage. He looked at her with the particular expression he had now, the one that wasn't quite admiration, but was related to it, the expression of a man who has repeatedly discovered that the person he lives with is more than he'd bargained for in the best sense. All right, he said. He left at dawn the next morning with the wagon and a folded paper in his pocket with Vera's numbers written on it. She didn't let herself think about whether it would work. She baked bread. The days that followed had a quality of suspended motion, everything moving fast and nothing feeling certain. Vera kept the production going, kept the deliveries on schedule, kept Briggs satisfied with consistent quality and timing. She wrote a carefully worded letter to the railroad regional office, acknowledging the qualification review and stating the Mercer Supply Operations' intention to meet the new standard in full. Professional, specific, no complaints. She wanted there to be a record that she'd engaged with the process rather than fought it. She heard nothing back. Blackwell appeared on the road again on the second Friday. Not stopping this time, just riding past at a pace that was casual in the practiced way of deliberate things. She was at the stand when he went by. She kept her eyes on her customer, a foreman from the construction team who was buying a week's worth of produce for his crew's cook. Blackwell didn't look at her, which was worse, somehow, than if he had. Grant came back on Sunday. He came back with Calloway riding alongside him in the wagon, and behind them, 2 more wagons loaded with sacked wheat. Vera came out of the baking structure when she heard the wheels, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron, and she stood in the yard and looked at the wagons and at the men on them. Calloway, who she'd never met, with his careful, weathered face and his hands that looked like they'd spent 40 years in the earth, and 2 other men behind him who had that same quality of people who had been doing hard work for a long time and were still standing. Grant climbed down from the wagon. He was dirty from the road and had the look of a man who hadn't slept much in 2 days and had found it worth it. They came, he said. I see that, she said. She walked out to meet Calloway, her hand extended. He looked at it, then at her, then shook it with a firm, brief grip. Grant says you pay honest, Calloway said. I do, she said. Blackwell's been taking a cut off our price for 2 years, he said. Not much each time. Enough over time. He looked at his wagon. I got 400 pounds of wheat I've been sitting on. Tom and Reeve behind me have about the same. He looked back at her. If you're buying direct and paying what the number on that paper says, we'd rather deal with you. Then we have a deal, she said. Calloway nodded. We do. She got them unloaded, got the wheat to Marsh, for milling on a rush arrangement she'd already discussed with him by letter, and stood in the yard in the early evening after the southern farmers had gone, looking at the production numbers she'd updated in the ledger. They could make the quota. It was tight. It was genuinely uncomfortable in its tightness, but the numbers were there. What she didn't know, couldn't know yet, was what Blackwell would do next. She'd moved around his supply chain, reached directly to the people he'd been controlling, and brought them into an arrangement that cut him out entirely. That was not something a man like Cedric Blackwell would absorb quietly. She'd been watching him long enough to know that he was patient and that he was careful. But she'd also been watching long enough to know that patient, careful men, when they decide to stop being patient, tend to move in ways that are very difficult to counter. She went inside, updated the ledger, and sat with the numbers for a while. 5 weeks left on the qualification period. Production on target. Supply chain restructured. Cash reserves stretched to breaking. And Blackwell, somewhere east on that road, sitting with information about exactly how exposed they were. She closed the ledger. She did not sleep well that night, but she slept. And that, she decided, was enough. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Monday morning, 3 weeks before the qualification deadline, when Owen Marsh's delivery wagon didn't arrive. Vera was at the baking structure by 5 in the morning, the fire already running, Eli measuring out the previous batch's remainder. She had enough flour for one full production run, enough to cover Tuesday's delivery, but nothing left for Friday without the fresh supply. She waited until 8, which was 2 hours past Marsh's usual time, before she sent Eli on horseback to the mill road. He came back an hour later. "The bridge is out," he said, still slightly breathless from the ride. The one south of the river crossing. It gave way in the night. There was water coming down fast from the hills. Marsh's wagon is on the other side. He can see the road, but he can't get across. Vera set down what she was holding. "How bad is the crossing?" Eli said the water's high, but moving, not flood high. Just, the bridge is gone and there's no ford for another 4 miles east. Grant came in from the yard at that point, having heard the last part. He looked at Vera. 4 miles east is Cutter's Ford, he said. It's passable when the water's not up. But if it rained as much last night as it sounded, can you get there and back with the wagon before Tuesday morning? He calculated it. She could see him doing it, the way he calculated things now. Not with the instinctive avoidance he'd had in September, but head-on, working the actual numbers. Possibly, if the ford's passable, if Marsh can get his wagon to the other side in time, if nothing else goes wrong. There was a lot of if in that sentence. "Go now," she said. "I'll send Eli ahead on horseback to tell Marsh where to meet you." Grant was already moving. She watched the wagon pull out of the yard and stood there for a moment in the cool morning air, listening to the sound of the wheels fading. Then she went back to the baking structure and began calculating how to stretch what flour she had as far as it would go without dropping below the quality standard that Briggs had come to expect. There was a version of this problem that could be managed, and there was a version that couldn't, and the difference between them was about 40 pounds of flour. She was still working through this calculation when a rider came up the road from the east and turned in at the gate. She didn't recognize him at first, a young man, unfamiliar, riding with the purposeful speed of someone carrying a message. He pulled up in the yard and asked for Mrs. Mercer, and when she said that was her, he handed down a folded paper without getting off his horse. "From Mr. Blackwell's office," he said. "He asked for a response if you have one." She unfolded it right there in the yard. It was brief. Blackwell's handwriting was precise and even, the handwriting of a man who said exactly what he meant and nothing extra. It informed her that effective immediately, the flour pricing from all distributors within his network had been adjusted to reflect current market conditions. The new price was listed. It was 40% higher than what she'd been paying Hollis. She read it twice. Then she looked at the rider. "Tell Mr. Blackwell I received his letter." The rider left. She went inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and looked at the number she'd written in the ledger 2 months ago next to Blackwell's name. Watch more carefully. She had been watching, but watching hadn't been enough. The flour price increase didn't touch her directly. She was buying from Marsh, not Blackwell's network. But Marsh bought his grain from suppliers, and some of those suppliers were connected back to the network, and a 40% increase upstream would work its way down in a matter of weeks. More importantly, the timing was deliberate. The bridge was out. Grant was trying to reach Marsh by an alternate route. She was 3 weeks from a qualification deadline with flour inventory for one production run. And now every other source of flour within reasonable distance just got 40% more expensive. She sat with it for a while, not in despair exactly, but in the hard-edged clarity that comes when you understand fully the size of what's in front of you. Blackwell had been patient, and now he was moving, and he was moving on multiple fronts simultaneously. The bridge going out was weather, not malice, but he'd seen the same weather she had and decided it was the right moment. She opened the ledger to the current page and started writing numbers. Grant came back at 4 in the afternoon with a partial flour delivery. Marsh had gotten his wagon to the east side of the broken crossing but couldn't get the full load across the water without risking the wagon, so they'd transferred sacks by hand, load by load, across a makeshift plank arrangement. Grant had flour down to his boots and a cut on one hand from a rope that had slipped. He came into the kitchen, saw her face, and said, "What else?" She showed him the letter. He read it, set it down. "He's raising prices across the network while our supply line is disrupted." "Yes." "Which means even if we get through this week, our cost basis goes up." "Marsh's grain sources aren't all free of his network," she said. "Some of them we'll have to pass the increase on. Maybe not immediately, maybe not all of it, but some." She tapped the ledger. "I've been calculating. If our flour cost goes up by 20%, not 40, 20, our margin on the contract gets thin enough that we'd have to raise our prices to Briggs. And Briggs has a budget." Grant looked at the numbers. He was quiet for a bit. "So he doesn't have to destroy us. He just has to make us unprofitable. Or make us miss the quota. Either one breaks the contract." They looked at each other across the table. The cut on his hand had been wrapped with a strip of cloth and was still seeping a little through the bandage. Outside, the afternoon had gone gray and was threatening more rain. "How much do we have?" Grant asked. "Honestly, if we stripped everything down to what's in the box right now," she told him. He nodded slowly. "That's not nothing. It's not enough for another full supply run if costs jump again." "No." He looked at the window, then back at her. "Vera, this is the part where most people would take the loss and step back. I know. I'm not saying we should. I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. "What are you thinking?" She had been thinking about Calloway, about the look on his face when he'd said Blackwell's been taking a cut off our price for 2 years, about Tom and Reeve and their loaded wagons coming up the ranch road, about the particular quality of people who have been squeezed for a long time and are waiting for something to push back against. "I'm thinking we're not the only ones he's doing this to," she said. Grant waited. "The price increase isn't just for us," she said. "It's across the network. Every baker, every small producer who buys from his distribution, they all just got a 40% increase with no warning." She looked at the letter. "That's not just about hurting us. That's him deciding the moment is right to take more from everyone." "Because we've been moving independently," Grant said slowly. "We made him look at his grip on the region and decide to tighten it. Something like that." She closed the ledger. "I want to go to Mabel." He looked at her. "Tonight?" "Tonight." Mabel Quinn's boarding house was a mile from the ranch, toward town, a long 2-story building that had been added on to 3 times since she'd built the original structure in the early 70s. It had 12 rooms and a common dining table that served as the informal information center of Redstone Crossing, and Mabel had been at that table long enough to know everyone worth knowing within 30 miles. She opened the door before they knocked. She'd seen the lamp coming up the road and took one look at both of them and said, "Come in and sit down and I'll put the kettle on." Vera laid it out at the table, the bridge, the partial delivery, the price letter, the qualification deadline, the margin calculation. Mabel listened without interrupting, her hands folded in front of her, her face doing the thing it did when she was filing and cross-referencing information in real time. When Vera finished, Mabel sat quietly for a moment. Then, "He raised it 40%. Effective immediately. That's going to hit the Halverson Bakery in town," Mabel said, "and Chet Pryor's feed and grain, and—" She stopped. "Clara Britton, who does the pastry supply for the hotel. She's been buying from Hollis for years." She looked at Vera. "He's done this before, smaller scale. Usually it works because nobody's organized and people just absorb the cost. But it usually doesn't come right when someone's in the middle of trying to prove their operation is viable," Vera said. "No," Mabel agreed. "That part is specific to you." Grant leaned forward. "Mabel, you know the Halverson family, the bakery? Known Ruth Halverson since before her husband built that shop. And Pryor? Chet Pryor comes in here for supper twice a week, has for 10 years. Grant looked at Vera. She looked back at him and saw that they were thinking the same thing, which had become a reliable phenomenon over the past months. Not because they were alike, but because they'd learned to follow each other's logic. What if we're not trying to beat the quota alone? Vera said. Mabel went very still. If Halverson's bakery is producing and they have the same problem we have, disrupted supply, elevated costs, then maybe the answer isn't each of us separately trying to survive. Maybe the answer is combining the production run. She laid it out carefully because she was still working through it herself. I have the railroad contract and the delivery relationship. Ruth Halverson has an established bakery and more baking capacity than I do. Callaway and his neighbors have wheat. Marsh can mill. If we can bring those pieces together for the qualification deadline, you're talking about one production operation pulling from multiple people's resources, Mabel said. For the purpose of the qualification period, Vera said. If we meet the standard jointly, the contract continues. After that, we can work out a longer-term arrangement that makes sense for everyone. Mabel looked at her for a long moment, then at Grant, then back at Vera. You'd need Ruth Halverson to agree by tomorrow if you're going to make the deadline. And Callaway. And Marsh. Yes, Ruth is stubborn and she doesn't like being told what to do. I'll go to her myself. In the morning, first thing. And Callaway? He's no stranger to Blackwell's games, but he'd be putting himself further out on the ledge. I know, I'm not going to minimize that to him. Mabel picked up her cup, turned it in her hands. The kitchen was quiet except for the low sound of the stove and the occasional creak of the old house adjusting to the night air. There's one more thing, she said. The flour that's in Marsh's mill right now, from Callaway's wheat. The advance arrangement you paid for. About 300 pounds finished stock. Blackwell doesn't know about that arrangement, Mabel said. Not specifically. He knows you've been bypassing his network, but he doesn't know the particular inventory at Marsh's mill right now. She looked at Vera. If he finds out, he'll find a way to move against it. Then we need to move it before he can. From the mill to here, or to Halverson's, wherever we end up centralizing production. She thought about the bridge. Is the bridge actually down, or is it just impassable to a wagon? The planking gave way, Grant said, but Eli said the supports are still there. Someone who knew what they were doing could probably replace the planking in a day, maybe two. Vera turned to look at him. I know what I'm suggesting, he said. I'll need help. Callaway's men are used to working, she said. Grant almost smiled. The next morning was the longest single day Vera could remember, and she had some competition for that title in recent months. She was at Ruth Halverson's bakery at 6 in the morning before the shop opened, and she knocked on the back door where the ovens were because that was where a baker would be at 6 in the morning. Ruth Halverson opened the door with flour on her forearms and an expression that said she had no patience for whatever this was. She was perhaps 50, compact and direct, with the bearing of someone who had run her own operation long enough that she'd stopped apologizing for her opinions. Mrs. Mercer, she said, you're up early. I need to talk to you, Vera said. It's about Blackwell's price letter. Ruth's expression changed. You got one too. Yesterday. Ruth stepped back and opened the door wider. They talked for an hour. Ruth Halverson was indeed stubborn. She pushed back on 3 different points and made Vera explain her reasoning twice on 2 others. She asked about the railroad contract specifics, the qualification period, the exact production numbers. She was not easily persuaded, and Vera didn't try to persuade her so much as simply lay out the situation in full and let Ruth's own practical intelligence work on it. If I contribute production capacity to your contract, Ruth said finally, what's my standing with the railroad afterward? You're the contract holder. I've thought about this, Vera said. I'd want to bring your operation in formally as a sub-supplier, in writing, with the railroad's acknowledgement. She paused. This isn't me asking you to save my contract. I'm asking you to join something that benefits both of us. Ruth looked at her. You're asking me to trust you? Yes, Vera said. I barely know you. You know what I've built in 8 months starting from a decorative flower bed? Something shifted in Ruth's face. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. I heard about that, she said. She looked at the oven, at the flour on her arms, at the letter that was sitting on her work table, its increased number visible from where Vera was standing. All right, Ruth said, but I'll want a proper written agreement before I touch a shovel of your flour. I'll have it for you by noon, Vera said. She went from Halverson's bakery to Callaway's farm, south of the river, or as close to it as she could get with the bridge down. She crossed on the makeshift plank arrangement that Grant and Eli had reinforced the previous afternoon, walked the rest of the way to Calloway's door, and spent 2 hours at his kitchen table with him and Tom Reeve explaining the plan. Calloway listened with the unhurried attention of a man who had learned not to decide quickly when the stakes were real. "So you want us to donate grain," he said. "Not sell. Donate." "For the qualification run," Vera said. "The payment comes from the contract renewal. I'm asking you to take a short-term risk on the guarantee of a longer-term market. With you as the market, and with Halverson's. And if this works the way I think it does, with the expanded contract." She met his eyes. "Calloway. Blackwell raised his prices 40% across the network yesterday. You don't sell to him anymore, but your neighbors do. How much do you think that's going to cost them this season?" Calloway was quiet. "He's doing this because we made him feel his grip loosening," she said. "If we fall now, it tightens back on everyone. If you hold, he said. "We hold," she said. He looked at her for a long time, then at Tom, who shrugged the shrug of a man who has already made up his mind but is being polite about it. "I'll give you 200 pounds, Calloway said. "Tom and Reeve can match that if they agree, which they'll have to tell you themselves." He picked up his cup. "And I want to be at that railroad office when you present." "I'd be glad to have you there," she said. She rode back over the plank crossing and was at her kitchen table with the ledger by mid-afternoon, recalculating the combined production capacity with Ruth Halverson's ovens added to the operation. The number came back higher than the quota. Not by a lot, but higher. Grant came in while she was still at the table and looked over her shoulder at the numbers. He put his hands on her shoulders briefly, and she reached up and put one hand over his without looking away from the page. "The bridge planking," she said. "Eli and I can start tomorrow. Calloway's men will help from the south side." He paused. "It'll hold a loaded wagon. I'll make sure of it." "I know you will," she said. She kept her hand on his a moment longer. Then she picked up her pen and went back to the numbers because there were 3 weeks left, and there was still everything to do, and the ground did not wait for the people who worked it to stop and feel their feelings about it, but she felt them anyway. Quietly, without ceremony, at a kitchen table in the last of the afternoon light, with a ledger full of numbers that were beginning, just beginning, to look like something that might be enough. The bridge held. Grant and Eli finished the new planking on Wednesday afternoon, working from the north side while Calloway's men worked from the south, and when they met in the middle and the last board was nailed down, someone tested it by driving a loaded cart across at normal speed. The planking flexed but didn't give. Grant checked the joints on his knees, standing in the cold water up to his shins, and declared it sound. Vera heard about it secondhand because she was at Ruth Halverson's bakery when it happened, going over the combined production schedule for the final 2 weeks of the qualification period. She received the news from Eli, who rode in flushed with something between relief and pride, and she allowed herself 30 seconds of quiet gratitude before going back to the numbers. There were always more numbers. The final 2 weeks had a quality she would remember for a long time afterward. Not fondly exactly, but with the particular respect you develop for difficult things that don't break you. The production operation ran across 3 locations: the outdoor baking structure at the ranch, Ruth Halverson's bakery in town, and Marsh's mill south of the river, which had become a kind of staging point for the flour supply chain. Every morning, Vera was up before light. Every evening, she was still at the table when the lamp needed refilling. Ruth Halverson turned out to be an exceptional baker and a difficult collaborator, which was roughly what Vera had expected from their first conversation. She had strong opinions about proofing times, oven temperatures, and the correct ratio of salt to flour, and she expressed these opinions without particular concern for whether the timing was convenient. On the 3rd day of the combined operation, they had a disagreement about batch sizing that lasted 40 minutes and ended with both of them making a compromise that neither was entirely satisfied with. The bread that came out of that compromise was the best of the entire production run. Vera mentioned this to Ruth at the end of the day, and Ruth looked at the loaves and said, without warmth but without hostility either, "Good flour helps." Then she stacked the loaves with the efficient movements of a woman who had been doing this since she was young and went on to the next task. It was not a friendship exactly, but it was something that worked, which Vera had come to understand was often better. Grant drove the deliveries every Tuesday and Friday with Eli riding alongside for the heavier loads. Briggs received each delivery with his customary sparse attention, checked the counts, inspected the quality, and said nothing either positive or negative, which Vera had come to interpret as the highest praise he offered. On the third-to-last delivery before the deadline, he held a loaf longer than usual, turned it over in his hands, and said, "The quality's improved." "Different oven," Grant said. Briggs set the loaf down. "The men have been eating better this spring than any season I can remember." He said it to the wagon rather than to Grant directly, which was his way. That matters for work output. The company doesn't measure it that way, but it matters. Grant drove home and told Vera, and she wrote it in the ledger, not as a number, just as a note. "Briggs, quality matters. Men work better." She kept things like that because sometimes the things that weren't numbers were the ones that turned out to matter most. The last week before the deadline was when the final disaster arrived. It came on a Thursday night, the night before the last qualifying delivery, the one that would close out the 6-week period and either meet the standard or fall short. A late-season storm moved in from the northwest, harder than anything they'd had since February, driving rain that turned to ice by midnight and coated everything by morning in a thin, treacherous shell. Vera woke at 4 to the sound of it and lay in the dark listening and understanding immediately what it meant for the road to the camps. She got up. Grant was already in the kitchen. He'd gone out to check the wagon and come back in. His coat was wet, his jaw tight. "The road east is iced over past the creek crossing," he said. "I can get the wagon to the crossing, but after that it's too dangerous at any speed that would get us there on time." "How long before it clears?" "If it warms up fast, 4 or 5 hours. The ice'll go. But the delivery window is 8 to noon. If we can't get moving by 7, we miss it," she said. He didn't answer. She stood in the kitchen and thought. The fire in the stove was burning low, and she pushed more wood into it without thinking about it, the automatic competence of a woman who has kept fires going for months. The ice outside ticked against the window glass. "What's the flour situation?" she asked. "Everything's baked. The loaves are in the cold storage. We have the full count." He paused. "It's not the production that's the problem." "I know." She looked at the window. "Dodd?" Grant looked at her. "Dodd has men," she said. "He's been buying from us since the first week. He knows the camps, he knows the road, and he has heavy workhorses that handle ice better than our wagon team." She was already moving. "Where's Eli?" "Barn, probably." "Send him to Dodd's. Now, before it gets any later." She was pulling on her coat. "And I need to get word to Ruth. She has the second sight loaves. I need to know they're secured." "Vera," Grant caught her arm. Not to stop her, just to make her pause. "What if Dodd can't do it either? What if the road's too bad for anyone?" She looked at him. His face in the low lamplight was tired and honest. The face of a man who had stopped pretending things were simple and was asking a real question. "Then we do everything we can," she said. "And if it still falls short, we deal with that when we get to it." She held his eyes. "But I'm not stopping until I know for certain there's no way through." He let go of her arm. "I'll get Eli." Dodd came. That was the thing she would carry with her afterward, the thing that mattered most about that iced-over Thursday morning. That when Eli showed up at Thomas Dodd's door at 5 in the morning with an urgent message, Dodd didn't ask how much it would pay. He asked what needed to be done. He showed up at the ranch with 2 men and a heavy freight wagon pulled by a team of 4 draft horses that had, as Vera had correctly guessed, experience with bad road conditions. He looked at the ice, looked at the wagon loaded with bread, looked at Vera standing in the yard in the gray pre-dawn, and said, "We'll need to chain the wheels for the creek crossing." "Whatever you need," she said. "I'm not promising we make the window," he said. "I'm promising we try." "That's all I'm asking." It took them until 6:30 to get the wagon properly rigged for the ice. Chains on the wheels, weight redistributed, the horses checked and rechecked. Vera and Grant loaded the second batch of loaves. Ruth had sent Eli back with confirmation that her production was secure and ready for collection, and by 7, they were moving. Vera rode on the wagon bench beside Dodd. Grant followed behind on horseback in case anything needed to be handled from the ground. The road east was exactly as bad as described. The ice sheeting the ruts, the horses finding purchase slowly and carefully, the wagon moving at a pace that made Vera watch the sky anxiously and calculate the time against the distance, with the focus of someone for whom that calculation had very immediate consequences. The creek crossing was the worst part. One of the horses slipped and caught itself, and the wagon slid sideways 2 feet before the chains bit and held, and Vera gripped the bench with both hands and did not make a sound. Dodd brought them through with a steadiness she would remember. No panic, no overcorrection, just the solid competence of a man who understood heavy loads and knew how to keep them moving. They came into Camp 4 at 8:47 in the morning. Briggs was waiting. He had the look of a man who had been doing paperwork for 2 hours and was not sure the wagon was going to arrive. And when Vera climbed down from the bench with ice still on her boots, he looked at her and at the wagon and at Dodd's team and said simply, "You made it." "We made it," she said. The unloading took 20 minutes. The count was right. She'd checked it herself 3 times during loading, then again after the creek crossing, then once more when they'd arrived. Every loaf accounted for. The produce in the second crates, the preserves, the eggs packed in straw that had survived the ice, and the slipping and the slow, hard road. Briggs signed the delivery receipt. He handed her the copy, and she folded it and put it in her coat pocket and felt for the first time in 6 weeks the specific sensation of a held breath releasing. Then Briggs said, "The regional office is sending a man tomorrow for the formal qualification review." She looked at him. "I've submitted my observation report," he said. "You should know that. I've documented every delivery, every quality check, the production volume." He paused. "I wrote it accurately. Whatever they decide, my report reflects what actually happened." "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and went back inside. She stood in the camp yard for a moment. Around her, workers were moving between tents and equipment, the normal business of a construction camp in morning. Someone was cooking something that smelled like onions, and she recognized the particular domestic smell of her own produce in someone else's fire, which was a strange and satisfying thing to notice. Grant rode up beside her. "Well?" "Tomorrow," she said. "They send someone tomorrow." He looked at her. The ice on the road was already softening in the morning light, the temperature coming up the way it sometimes did after these late storms. Brutal at night, gone by midday, leaving the world slightly washed and ordinary. A horse somewhere nearby shook itself and blew. "Then we go home," Grant said, "and we wait." "Yes," she said. "We go home." The regional inspector arrived the following morning. A man named Coates, mid-40s, with the careful, neutral expression of someone whose job required forming opinions without appearing to have them. He brought with him a representative from the railroad contracts office, and to Vera's measured surprise, a small group of people who had apparently come along to observe. Calloway, Tom Reeve, and 2 men she didn't recognize who Calloway later told her were the other wheat farmers from south of the river who'd contributed grain to the final production push, and Cedric Blackwell. He arrived separately, 15 minutes after the others, on his gray horse. He was dressed well, as always, and he dismounted with the ease of a man who expected to occupy whatever space he entered. He exchanged a brief word with the contract's representative that Vera couldn't hear and then took a position slightly apart from the group, watching. She had known he would come. She'd thought about it during the slow hours of the previous night, working through how she felt about it, and what she'd concluded was this. His presence was not a threat. His presence was, in fact, the best possible thing, because if the numbers were what she believed them to be, then everything he'd done over the past 6 weeks was going to be visible to everyone in this yard in the same moment. Coates sat up at a table in the camp's supply building and began reviewing the documentation. Vera presented the production records, the delivery receipts, the signed acknowledgments from Briggs going back to the beginning of the qualification period. She spoke clearly and without performance, just the numbers, the timeline, the method. Ruth Halverson had sent a written statement detailing her bakery's contribution to the combined production operation. Owen Marsh had sent his milling records. Calloway had brought his grain donation receipts in person. It took 2 hours. Coates went through everything twice. He asked questions, specific, technical questions about production capacity, delivery consistency, supply chain reliability, and Vera answered them directly. She didn't oversell. She didn't soften the parts that had been difficult. When he asked about the storm delay on the final delivery, she described exactly what had happened: the ice, the late wagon, Dodd's assistance, the arrival time of 8:47. "Still within the window," Coates said. "Yes." He noted it. When he got to the final count, the total production across the 6-week period, He looked at the number for a moment without speaking. Then he looked at Vera. "This is over the quota," he said. "Yes," she said, "by approximately 40%. She'd known the number. She'd added it up 12 times in the past 2 days because 12 times felt like enough to be certain. "Correct." Coates set down his pen. He looked at the documentation spread across the table, the weeks of delivery receipts, the quality reports from Briggs, the production logs, the supplier records. Then he looked at Vera with the expression of a man whose neutrality was working harder than usual. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "in 3 years reviewing supply operations along this corridor, I haven't seen a qualification period that cleared the standard by this margin under these conditions." He picked up the final delivery receipt, the one from yesterday morning, the ice road, the 47 minutes to spare. This is thorough documentation." "Thank you," she said. He signed the renewal paperwork then and there. Not after deliberation, not pending further review, then and there, with a pen that scratched across the paper in the quiet room, and the sound of it was, to Vera, one of the better sounds she'd heard in a long time. She walked out of the supply building into the morning light. The small group in the yard had been waiting. Grant was there, and Calloway, and Tom Reeve, and Dodd, who had come with the original delivery team, and Mabel Quinn, who had driven out from town because Mabel Quinn went where the important things were happening. Ruth Halverson had sent her son in her place, a young man of about 20 with his mother's direct eyes. Blackwell was still there too. He was standing slightly apart, and he was watching Vera's face as she came out the door, reading it the way a careful man reads outcomes he hasn't fully controlled. She looked at him. She didn't gloat. It wasn't in her nature, and it wouldn't have been useful. She simply held his gaze for a moment, long enough for both of them to understand what the moment meant, and then she looked away and went to the people who had made it possible. "It's done," she said. No one cheered. That wasn't the group for it. Calloway nodded with the deep, quiet satisfaction of a man whose 2 years of patience had just been validated. Dodd made a sound low in his throat that served as his version of celebration. Mabel put her hand briefly on Vera's arm and squeezed it. Grant didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just stood close enough that she could feel the solid, certain fact of him next to her, and that was its own kind of statement. Blackwell left before the formal meeting concluded. He rode east on his gray horse at a pace that wasn't hurried. He was too careful a man to show hurry, and he didn't look back. Vera watched him go and thought about what this meant for him. Not ruin, probably. Men like Blackwell had enough diversification that a single lost contract wouldn't break them. But the farmers south of the river had seen today what a different arrangement looked like. The contracts office had seen documentation of a supply operation that functioned without him. Briggs had a 3-year record showing his men ate better when they had variety. Those things had a slow, persistent effect that was harder to reverse than it was to build. The grip didn't break. It just loosened, permanently, in ways that mattered. That afternoon, sitting with Calloway and Tom Reeve and Owen Marsh at Mabel's table, the boarding house table that had hosted so many important conversations that it had probably absorbed them into the wood, Vera talked through what the expanded contract meant for the supply chain going forward. Marsh would be the primary mill, with a formal arrangement that protected his pricing. Calloway and the other southern farmers would have a guaranteed market at fair prices, documented and signed. Ruth Halverson's bakery would come in formally as a sub-supplier on the expanded volume. Dodd's team would handle emergency delivery backup at an agreed rate. It was not complicated. It was just several people deciding to function as something more organized than they had been, because they'd seen what organized looked like, and it had worked. "There'll still be pressure," Calloway said near the end of the conversation. He was looking at his coffee cup. "Blackwell doesn't go away because he lost a round." "No," Vera agreed. "He'll find other angles, other pressure points." "He will," she said. "But we'll be bigger than we were last time, and more connected." She looked around the table. "A year ago, I was alone on a ranch with an empty pantry. 3 months ago, we were scrambling to find flour. Today, we have a renewed contract, a working supply chain, and 4 separate operations that benefit from the same arrangement." She paused. "That's harder to break than one woman with a vegetable stand." Calloway looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. The cautious reserve of a man who had been let down enough times to be slow with trust, warming slightly. Not all the way, but slightly. You're not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? He thought about it. Someone more desperate. She smiled. I was desperate. I just couldn't afford to look it. He laughed at that, a short, genuine sound. And Tom Reeve laughed too, and even Marsh allowed a slow smile. And the table was briefly just a group of tired people who'd been through something hard together and come out the other side with the awkward, surprised relief of survivors. The ride home that evening was quiet. The road back from town ran straight south under a sky that was finally clear after weeks of weather, the kind of sky that appears after difficulty, washed clean and enormous, stars emerging early in the west. The wagon moved at an easy pace, the horses knowing the way. Grant drove. Vera sat beside him, her hands in her lap, watching the road ahead. The banknote, she said after a while. What about it? With the expanded contract income, we can pay it off. She'd been calculating since the afternoon. Not immediately. End of summer, maybe early fall. But we can pay it, all of it. Grant was quiet. That's the last one, she said. He let that sit for a moment, then, you know what that means? It means we own it, she said. All of it. Free. He nodded slowly. The road ran ahead of them through the dark, familiar, and solid. Vera, he said. He said it the way he sometimes said her name, not as an introduction to something else, just as a thing complete in itself. I know, she said. And she did know. She knew what it meant that this man, who had written careful letters to a stranger and stood on his porch, watching her tear up his roses with something between fury and helplessness, and she suspected now, a complicated hope, had become the person she thought with and worked beside and trusted with the full weight of what she was trying to build. It hadn't been graceful. It hadn't been the story either of them would have told in advance. It had been a year of hard work and harder conversations and the slow daily accumulation of evidence that they were capable of the same things, that they could see the same ground and want to make the same things from it. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, everything. She put her hand over his on the reins. He turned his palm up and held it. They drove home. The decorative yard was fully beds now, every square foot of it productive, the spring plantings up and running, the covered stand freshly painted by Eli on a slow afternoon when there was nothing else pressing. The hollyhocks were gone, but the tomatoes along the fence were putting out their first fruits, green and hard in the early summer warmth, and the beans were climbing the trellises Grant had built that first difficult autumn when he was still figuring out how to help without admitting he was helping. Vera walked the beds most mornings, not always because anything needed doing, but because the ground was hers, and she liked the specific intimacy of knowing every corner of it, which sections dried out first, where the drainage pooled, which rows got the best afternoon light. She'd grown up being told that a woman's domain was the house, and she'd never exactly argued with it. She'd just quietly found that the ground outside the house interested her more. It turned out the ground was the whole thing. People sometimes asked her, in the months afterward, travelers who'd heard the story, women from town who came to the stand, what the secret was. She understood the question, but she never quite knew how to answer it, because the honest answer wasn't a secret. It was just a decision, made once in the early morning with a spade in her hand and a husband on the porch telling her to stop. The decision that the appearance of something was worth less than the reality of it, and that she would rather build something real and take the consequences than maintain something false and call it safety. It was not a decision that felt brave in the moment. It felt cold and hard, and like something she was doing because there was nothing else left to do. Bravery is almost always like that. It doesn't announce itself. It just shows up in the space where you're out of better options and you keep moving anyway. What she couldn't have told you in September, when she was alone in the yard with the rose canes piling up around her, was that the decision wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who was connected to the ground she was standing on. The farmers south of the river selling below their worth, the workers eating salt pork for weeks, the millers and bakers and small operators who had been managed and maneuvered and slowly diminished by a system they hadn't built and couldn't escape. She hadn't been thinking about them that morning. She'd been thinking about turnips and railroad workers and an empty pantry. But a thing that works tends to pull people toward it, and people in proximity to something working tend to recognize it. And what starts as one woman in a garden becomes, If the ground is right and the timing holds, and enough people decide it's worth the risk, something larger than any of them intended. The ranch by late summer was debt-free, the first time in Grant's memory. He paid the final bank installment on a Friday morning in August, in the same office where the loan had been issued, and the banker shook his hand with the particular warmth that people extend to outcomes they weren't confident would happen. Grant thanked him and walked out into the August street and stood there for a moment in the heat and the ordinary town noise, feeling the specific and not quite real sensation of a weight he'd been carrying so long, he'd stopped noticing it finally being gone. He told Vera about it that evening. Not the money part. She'd tracked every payment in the ledger. She already knew the numbers. The other part, the standing in the street. Like something you'd forgotten was there, she said. Yes. He looked at his hands. I've been carrying that note for so long. I started to think it was just who I was. A man who owed. You built this place, she said. We built this place. She didn't argue with the correction because it was accurate, and he knew it was accurate. And one of the things they had settled between them over the past year was the habit of being accurate with each other, even when the easier thing would have been comfortable imprecision. In September, exactly a year after Vera had put her spade in the rosebed, the railroad expanded the contract again, this time to 4 additional camps along the eastern corridor. It was more volume than Vera and Ruth Halverson could produce alone, and the conversation about bringing in 2 more bakeries from neighboring towns was already underway, coordinated through Mabel's boarding house table, which had become the unofficial headquarters of what some people were starting to call, with varying degrees of seriousness, the Redstone Crossing Cooperative. Vera didn't love the name. It sounded more organized than it was and more permanent than she was ready to claim. But she understood why people wanted to call it something. Naming a thing is the first step to believing it'll last. And after everything it had taken to get here, maybe that was a reasonable thing to want. On a warm evening that September, she was in the beds doing the late-season inspection when she heard wheels on the road and looked up to see a wagon she didn't recognize. A family, from the look of it, a man and woman up front and children in the back, their belongings piled high, headed somewhere. Headed into the territory, into whatever they were building or trying to build, with all the particular combination of hope and not quite readiness that she recognized because she'd felt it herself exactly a year ago on a different road. The wagon slowed at her gate. The man looked at the stand, then at the beds, then at Vera standing in the middle of it all with dirt on her boots. "Afternoon," he said. "This your place?" "It is," she said. "You selling produce?" "Tuesday and Friday," she said. "Come back then." He nodded. His wife leaned forward a little and looked at the beds with the expression of someone who was doing the same kind of assessment Vera had done a year ago, cataloging, calculating, imagining what was possible. "You grow all this yourself?" the woman asked. Vera thought about that, about what yourself meant in this context, with Grant's irrigation work and Eli's careful hands and Calloway's wheat and Ruth's ovens and Dodd's ice road horses and Mabel's table and all of it, all the pieces of it, none of which she could have built alone. "No," she said, "not by myself." The woman nodded, as if this was exactly the right answer. The wagon moved on, east into the late summer evening, and Vera watched it go. And then she turned back to the work still waiting in the beds, which was, when she thought about it, exactly where she wanted to be. The ground was hers, and it was working, and that was the whole of it. That was enough.